All right. I hope you all had a great lunch. I did. And also great lunch conversations. And I hope there's still, so the after lunch dip is not too big. The good news is there will be another coffee break later on, so that's something to look forward to. In the next period, we're going to talk about unlocking the potential of open source. In particular, we want to talk about the process of bringing an internal project to an open source project and give you some guidance and best practice, at least from the perspective we have at Alliander, and some learnings you can take back to your organization or your projects. But before we dive into the details, let me shortly introduce myself and my colleague Nico. So I'm Jonas van der Bogaard. I'm working at Alliander, which is one of the distribution system operators in the Netherlands. And we manage about 1/3 of the Netherlands, which means that we are responsible for about 96,000 kilometers of electricity grid, and then over 40,000 kilometers of gas grid. And we have over 5 million to nearly 6 million customers around our area of responsibility. And we make sure in this area that the light stays on and households and companies stay warm. And I do that together with Nico and about 8,000 other colleagues. In particular, my role is as digital strategy lead. I'm responsible for looking a little bit forward, what's coming towards us in regards to digitalization. And in particular, I'm also responsible for Alliander's open source program office, which I am leading.
Indeed. And I work half of my time in the open source program office of Alliander. I have a background in IT, software development, also some electrical engineering actually, and free software development, open source. So all that combines pretty well in the open source program office. And I think we're a good mixed team in the open source program office to get different expertise going to actually support the projects that we host. And what we'll be presenting today is something that we often find that we've been doing open source as a being out there, being public for quite a while now, especially in the energy sector. And then other grid operators and energy companies, they come to us and say like, oh, could you please enlighten us? What do you have in your internal processes? How do you do that when you have an internal project that you want to move out there? So that inspired us to have these 2 consecutive presentations, one now more higher level process, and then the other one, which will be after this presentation, more about what kind of technical checks do we do in the projects to come up with any findings we might need to address.
And I won't be talking too much about what an open source program office is, because we did that in the panel before lunch. But just to give a short context, we as OSPO help, Alliander in particular, in the usage of open source software. So how do we consume open source software in our development teams in a compliance, but also secure way. We make it possible for developers throughout our organization to contribute. And we also make it possible to bring internal projects to open source. In particular, that last part is also the main topic of today, where we'll be talking about how we support our organization, in particular to bring an internal project to open source. But before we dive into that, we also have some questions for you. And we set up this quick Mentimeter to get your input. It should be as easy as scanning the QR code with your phone. If not, you can also go to mentimeter.menti.com and enter the code which is shown on this slide as well.
I see thumbs up.
Yeah, I see there's still some people scanning the QR code, so let's give them a minute to do so. See the last ones as well. Maybe the back is a little bit difficult. You can also go to Menti and enter the code. So the first question we have is, we were wondering who in the audience here has experience with transforming an internal project into an open source project.
Okay, plenty of no's, so that's good. Then you're in the right talk.
But also a lot of no's, but are planning to. So I think especially those, I hope this talk and our lessons learned can help you there. And also great to see that there is also peers in these organizations here in this room who has experience with this. So I hope you can maybe provide you some extra knowledge, but maybe you can also learn from you guys.
So when it comes to time for the questions and you have any suggestions, please feel free to do that at the end of the talk, so we can maybe get some lively discussion.
Yeah, exactly. And we have one other question for you guys, and it's more an open question. We're really wondering what your thoughts and impressions are that come to mind when you want to transform an internal project to an open source project. And we're going to do our best to try to address some of these thoughts and impressions during the presentation. I see that documentation is showing up. Security, governance, community, collaborations, maintainability, legal. I'm really happy with the impressions and thoughts that come to mind. And we will address certainly many of them. And we will try, maybe if there's one which comes not forward in the presentation, feel free to raise them in the questions afterwards. And we also make this word cloud part of the presentation, which you will find later on the LF Energy Summit website.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting.
So now you can sit back and relax. So, Nico, tell us a little bit about our journey in the last few years and about which projects we have open source through the years.
Yeah, so maybe I can tell it from my perspective joining the OSPO, right? I was open source enthusiast in the organization, and all of a sudden I heard, yeah, we're going to do open source in this part of the organization, and we're going to set up an open source program office. And I was like, oh, I need to be in on that. So there was we had an event in one of our locations in 2018. You can still go back, watch the videos there. And it was all about open source and the steps you have to take as an organization to adopt open source, how to establish an OSPO, things like that were discussed. And eventually, not much later, I was actually enabled to participate in the OSPO. And then we were met with the challenge. Okay, we have incentive, we got sponsorship from management to actually start an OSPO, but what do we do? And we took inspiration from the Linux Foundation project checklist that they already had, a set of recommendations to look for. And we got started with that as a base. And immediately you see two projects on the left, the Compass and Grid Exchange Fabrics. That was the first projects we launched. And actually GXF on the bottom was already an open source project at the time under a different name. So we can only apply hindsight if we were to make any changes to that, because it was already a public project. And Compass was one of the first projects that went to the OSPO, and we were supporting to make that open source. But this was also something that was created from scratch, with the intention of being an open source project together with other organizations. So yes, we did apply some of the principles we had at the time, but this was very much an early stage. And then later on, you see some more projects in 2021. And these are key projects that were internal projects, which actually went through the process we'll be showing you, where we did a review and supported the teams to come up with a good base for an open source project. And OpenStaff on the bottom, the short-term energy forecaster, that has a history within Alliander of about 7 years, I think, before we made it as an open source project under the Linux Foundation Energy. So it was really a discussion about what part do we take, can we take everything, or maybe some use cases are not generic enough. But that really went through this process. And similarly, but quite differently, was the weather provider API, which is not under the governance of the Linux Foundation Energy, but you can find it on our website and GitHub, which was also an internal project. And Shapeshifter, which is also interesting because it was an open collaborative project about standards. So standards is completely different from open source in a way, about the legal issues, how do you collaborate, different things come into play there. And so we transformed an existing open community to a new one under a different governance. And then in 2022 we have the super advanced meter, which was again a new initiated project. And PowerGrid model, another project like OpenStaff, which has a long history, and where we did then is really leverage inner source. There was also on the slide that Jonas showed what is the focus areas of an OSPO. We leveraged inner source to get an internal developer base around the project to make sure that we had something of a project that was actually reusable, and it had a good boundary. Like this is already documentation people can understand because other developers were able to work with that. That can be imported as a library. So that helped mature the project before going through this process and being open. And on the latter side, you see some different projects. It was more recently, which are smaller in terms of size and scope and maybe ambition, I'm not sure. A Python library of dealing with CGMES, Common Information Model, which is rather small and it does what it does, but still it has to go through this process within the OSPO. The OSPO code scanner, this will be demonstrated in the presentation here afterwards, something we developed at the OSPO ourselves. And the ability model, a generic architectural model of how do we view the energy sector as a common framework to think about architecture. And then you work with documentation, and you also have to deal with different people which might have different expectations when it comes to open source, or have a different background. They're not, for example, might not be as used to being on GitHub. And all this time, when we evaluated all these projects, we kept refining this internal process.
So before diving into this internal process we have, Nico, can you give a little bit background about what motivates us as organization to bring those projects to open source?
Yeah, in general, the way the reason we started as Alliander with an open source program office is we seek innovation, right? We are a grid operator, a third of the Netherlands. The energy transition is hitting us hard. We could have put in a slide of the current state of the grid in the Netherlands if you want a connection. This is pretty much red in the whole Netherlands. If you want a connection for consumption or generation, the grid is up to its capacity. So we have to be, well, as we saw in the keynotes, right? Maybe it's a capacity for only a week in the year, 7 days in the year. But how do we leverage the flexibility that is there to create more capacity for the rest of the year, and so that we can connect consumers, businesses to the grid? And open source software is really about achieving those innovation that we need. And previous to that, as Alliander, I'd say we started with quite a substantial IT organization. Right? I mentioned that we had projects which had a long internal history, Power Grid Model, OpenStaff. These are quite innovative projects, doing load flow calculations and doing energy predictions in somewhat a slightly different way. So we were trying to do the innovation ourselves, but you can only go so far, and it really helps if you can get the open source collaboration under the Linux Foundation Energy. So that is what we're seeking for most of the projects, get collaboration with other organizations. We also have on our GitHub page, we have some examples where it's like we have some infrastructure and we just have an example and we share it because others might be interested to take it as an example, and then we use a similar solution. There's a whole different type where there's no real effort to seek collaboration. It's just, we have something that works for us, here you go, please, if it's helpful for you, do it like that. Yeah. But still, we have some parts here on the slide. It could mean that if others start adopting a similar solution, that you drive sort of a standard is maybe a big word, but a standard approach to, in this case, something about, we have something about identification in the cloud infrastructure. If others have a similar issue and they start addressing it in a similar way, we can work with vendors to change their offering to meet our needs as well as theirs. The common voice that was also addressed during the keynotes this morning. But I'd say most in general, we seek collaboration, come up with the open source solutions, and work with vendors to increase the ecosystem of software.
Yeah, maybe to add to that. So for us, not each open source project has the same motivation or business strategy behind it. Quite often the goal of bringing it open source is that we can accelerate the innovation around that project, to collaborate with others. But sometimes it is also an enabler to increase collaboration with a particular partner, and that can be another DSO, but it can also be our customers. So the Shapeshifter project is a great example. It builds a standard which is used between our congestion management platform and aggregators which are connected to that platform. So it provides a standard which provides the information shared between in that communication, but also provide the software to implement that standard. So it makes it more easy for new aggregators to implement and connect to the congestion management platform through that standard, but also through the software that Shapeshifter provides. And it also provides the aggregators to come up with feedback or improvements in that software if they see something missing. So let's dive into the process. We have been developing over the years around transforming an internal project into open source projects. So Nico, before we dive into each of these 7 steps in more detail, can you give us a high-level overview of the aspects we have to consider?
Yeah, so generally we have a checklist, right? We work with the project and we go from left to general consideration through legal assessment, technical assessment, and then finally launch and maintain and doing the branding and marketing. This doesn't mean that this is a sequential process, that you only think about the branding and marketing once the project is out there. It doesn't mean that any collaboration or generic concerns could not come up later in the process. But in general, I think that the trend is there to put things in the right order. So we start with the general considerations. And we challenge the people coming to us, like, we want to open source this project. That's often the case. And then we ask them, why do you want to do that? What is your reason to do that? And often we challenge, why not consider joining an existing project? So it could be that you have this library we developed in-house and it works really well. But if there's already something out there which has 10 times, 100 times more users, it might be interesting to contribute to that library or project and make it work for us, contribute our insights, and start using that one, and leverage that existing user base, because they have found the need for that, rather than trying to be smart and say, okay, no, we have found the real solution here, and we're going to compete actually with the existing project. So that's something worth a challenge. And similarly, it is key, I think, to identify partners from the beginning. And we only learned this somewhat further along the way, that if you have a project out there as an open source project, I mean, on the one hand, it's obvious that you cannot expect people to come up and just start contributing, start using it, right? Sometimes you have this one issue, it's like, oh, I'm from this and this organization, I'm interested, or maybe can we get a demo? Sure, that happens. But it's far more interesting if you can get in contact in the early phase when the project is not even open, to discuss with an organization, do you have a similar need? Would this be fitting? Maybe the other organization already has some projects themselves. Maybe they're willing to open source that, or start a collaborative effort to create something new based on all the insights. So you get a dialogue, and I think eventually the end solution becomes better. Yeah. So at least you want to identify these partners and seek collaboration.
Yeah. Maybe to add on that, so for us, Alliander, it's important that we have this conversation with the potential party before we make the decision to go open source, because making an internal project open source is also an investment. And so it helps to take the opportunity to validate our ideas, because we can believe that there's a great opportunity there to collaborate. But it's important that we validate that with our potential collaborators, and if they see have a similar vision on that, and we can also it would be great if we can make that vision also more concrete, because that may well also help us to define the process to open source. Is it something we want to accelerate because this partner has this urgency or this momentum to invest in this new solution? Or is there a particular part of the project which has more priority than others? So it's really helpful. We learned over the years to have this conversation quite early in the process. So that brings us to the second step. So we have talked about general considerations. The second step is more about looking into the business case. Yeah. So Nico, what's part of that?
I think a business case to many, especially when you talk to developers, it's like, yeah, I have this great project and I want to make it open source. Yeah, but what is the business case? Because people overlook often not just the effort it takes to initially release a project as an open source project, but also to keep maintaining it and give it some longevity and seek this collaboration. Of course, that's something we address, like, do you seek this collaboration, or is it just publish it for others to know about and to be inspired by, or are you seeking that collaboration? Because then it does require some effort, and it's good to make that explicit, because then they can also make a commitment on that. So we ask about, I mean, it's a guess, right? But we say like, okay, give us about 3 years of commitment to actually make this a collaborative project. That's what we give as an indicator to the product owners, product managers that are involved, that, okay, it takes effort to get from an internal project to outside and get to collaboration. And it also helps to come up with a roadmap. As I said, how ambitious is your project going to be when it comes to development? I showed CGMES. I mean, we knew from the start that this project is just an implementation of a standard. The standard is quite limited. We don't expect the standard to change much. We don't expect the Python ecosystem to change much. So once we're done, we're done. We can update the dependencies, keep maintaining, do some more outreach to get others involved. But then it's quite minimal effort. Whereas other projects, it's like, okay, this is just the first step, and we can start building and building and building. It's a whole different outlook which you have as a project.
Yeah, and so it's good to mention that this business case. It doesn't have to be this 30-page document with all the details. It also depends a little bit on the size of the project, how deep you will, how extensive you want to make the business case. But it's always good to have at least on a high level, sharp vision around the objective, roadmap, investment, where you want to move forward. And what also is very important is the legal aspect of open sourcing a project, which is one which cannot be ignored and should definitely be part of the process. So Nico, which steps do we take in that area?
Yeah, the legal assessment, this is something that I think your OSPO can really shine. So when you think of an OSPO in an organization, right, we're trying to facilitate, get a project from internal to outside and make it a success. We are in a facilitating role, and working with lawyers, I've come to experience that they often ask questions, and they keep asking questions, and they want more certainty, and we're trying to broker or help this this discussion and get the project going. So really facilitate that discussion. This means that we do some checks ourselves. We support it from the Open Source Program Office. I don't know, it could be different in other organizations, but we have the internal capability within the OSPO to check the dependencies. We also maintain the internal license policies, like what licenses are we fine with having. We know a bit about the open source licenses. So we can do most of the assessment. If there's dependencies in the project, we can do that ourselves. But then there are other issues, like, is there a trademark involved? A certain name. Sometimes you have other things, patents, or especially if it's imagery. There might be other IP-related concerns. And it really helps to ask the project, the people that are involved with the project about these things. Because I've come to cases where you from an OSPO, you look at a superficial level at the project, you think there's no issue, and then you start talking with them, and it's like, oh, but maybe we have this and this, and okay, good that we know that, we can actually start checking it now. And then, of course, it's actually choosing a license. And choosing a license is also very much a discussion with the project. Of course, we have some preferred licenses we use often, but it also comes down to what do you want to do with your project. Is it a project that needs to go in a certain ecosystem where one of the licenses is the default? Okay, then it makes sense to use the same license because everybody else is using that and people are expecting to have that license. Or maybe you want to introduce some form of copyleft in your license so that you probably get more contributions back and you can help grow a community that way. These are discussions that you want to, of course we have the guidelines by the OSPO, but it also is very context dependent what we do with that.
So after we got the legal assessment done, we go to the technical assessment, where we really look to the state of the code and the documentation. Can you tell a little bit more about the baseline we set there?
Yeah. The technical assessments, like, do you have everything in order? Is the project of a good quality? And oftentimes when you speak to the project leads or the developers, they say, oh yeah, for sure, we got everything covered, and we know, okay, we add a good README. But it's really hard to, in this process, fix the code quality, make sure that all the internal context is sort of out there and that people from outside can understand the project, that there's good documentation that is accessible, and that you also thought about how do you deal with the project governance. We'll come back to that later. But what do newcomers, when they are interested in the project, what do they expect? Yeah, they go to a contributing MD, what did they read there? Now we have some templates and there's constantly being worked on. But I've come to find that this is something that is surely underestimated by people involved in the project. It's like, okay, just a couple of documentation. But then again, it's not complicated, but it has to be taken care of.
Yeah. it's also good to mention that it doesn't have to be perfect when we go open source. So first it's important that because we go bring an internal project open source, we have also a reputation to maintain. It needs to have a basic quality standard, both the code and the documentation. But of course, it doesn't have to be perfect. That we can also, during the journey of open source, and could be in a roadmap to further improve that. But it's one of the things we always look into in this step.
One thing that's on the slide as well might be worth addressing is that also check for security-related issues. Are there any secrets, things about the internal infrastructure for deployment, any passwords, API keys, personal information of colleagues who left the organization long ago who are not involved in this process. You want to get that out. And what we often do is just squash all the Git history. I mean, it would be perfect if you can actually release a project with all the Git history and all the, where it's coming from. But we haven't found a practical case for that. So just make it one commit and start from there.
And there's also great tooling and libraries out which can help you to scan the code base. And Nico will be talking about that in his next talk, more detailed. So, and we have the documentation ready, we've cleaned up the code, improved code quality. Then we have to think about governance and processes. Yeah, and
it's funny because one of our OSPO colleagues is in the room, and she Elena, and she has a long, she has more experience when it comes to project governance. So we had some discussions already if we can improve our own governance templates already, what we have now. So, but you have to think about project governance. Like, and as she said yesterday over a drink, it's like you have to think that now that everything is fine and good, what do you do when things go south and the project is in a bad state, or there's somebody involved who's no longer communicating, or he has a totally different vision from the rest and a strong opinion. What do you do in those cases? You have to think about that. Of course, you can come up with a governance structure with voting and come up with a process. It really helps, but you have to have something in place. Otherwise, when there's an emergency, you have to struggle to get something decided upon, and might result in the project splitting into a fork or something else, or stalling completely. So again, you have to think about your project governance. And sort of the practical aspect of project governance is, where's the project hosted? What kind of facilities do you have? Is there automated checks when people make a pull request, that they get feedback on the pull request immediately? Might even have an opinion about the labeling of issues. Is there a first a newcomers label on issues? We don't go into that detail, but these are things you might consider. And of course, a communication channel. We got that in the Linux Foundation Energies is clear, right? We have the chat communication channel on Slack. We have mailing lists. We have infrastructure for periodic online meetings. The same for the project governance, which is also provided on the Linux Foundation Energy. You have a structure in place, even though projects can deviate a bit on themselves, but at least the governance under the Linux Foundation Energy and the TAC is all decided upon. But if your project is, as we have some of the projects in your own organization, you're free to do whatever you like. Of course, you can get inspired by Linux Foundation Energy, but yeah, you have to think about what you want to do there.
Oh. And then come the moment there that you are about to launch your internal project to open source, which is, of course, often a celebration, but also consider some steps. So tell us about that, Nico.
Yeah, so when you launch a project, that's pretty much what we experienced the case, where you actually create a new repository with a new name, with all these files, and then you have to also do the checks about what do you want to put in place there. We talk about governance. But also, what we do as a best practice is ask for a developer certificate of origin. Like it's basically a sort of a legal way to say, like, okay, I am the this is my copyright of this code I contributed, belongs to me. I don't think it's a sort of a standard thing coming from Git, but it gives more legal certainty. So that's something we by default enable on all our repositories, and we encourage the projects from the beginning to opt for an OpenSSF best practices badge. So I don't know if you know it, it's worth looking up. It's also part of the Linux Foundation Energy project cycle? No, not the cycle.
A life cycle, yes.
Yeah, project life cycle. That in order to continue on the life cycle, right, from sandbox to initial to graduate, that you make a progression on this best practices badge. And it has all sorts of questions. It's sort of a self-assessment on do you have security-related issues addressed. So it's not a technical check. Of course, it refers to any technical checks you might want to apply, but it's more like a process-based assessment. And it really helps to say, okay, now that you have your project open, go work on getting to a certain baseline. And then also something, once you have your project open, think about the change log, periodic releases, so that you are also showing what kind of changes you make, and that it also looks like a lively project that's under active maintenance.
Yeah. And that brings us to the last step. So one step is bringing the project to open source. But that, I often say, that's not where the journey ends, that's where the journey starts. So the next step is to start building that open source community around the project. And what are important aspects of that, Nico? Yeah,
so hopefully, if we sort of follow this order, in the beginning, you already identified some partners. Maybe you had contact with partners. That's what we try to go for. And some of them might be involved with open sourcing the project. But once the project is there, you can actually start reaching out to them. Hey, we now have this project. We have this in this first meeting. Will you attend? Write them about any updates. Ask them for input, what they might be interested in. So you can, it's right. You have a project. You can start marketing and do sales in a way, right? And at the same time, also doing more community outreach, making maybe hosting an event or putting out blog posts to make it known to the world. And I think the community building, the fact that we have with PowerGrid model plenty of face-to-face meetings, is really powerful. No pun intended. But also here, right, with this summit. The fact that the projects are able to demonstrate what they're doing, make name for themselves, all those logos, I think that really helps market and brand the projects and make it appealing.
Oh. Thank you, Nico. See, we're going through time very quickly, which is great because that brings us slowly to end, but we still have some time also for questions. Yeah. So I want to, before we move to the questions, I want to mention that we also have Alliander / English or Netherlands open source website where you can find more information about our open source vision and projects. For the projects, if you're interested in Alliander's open source projects, you can always go to GitHub / Alliander open source where you can find our internal open source projects, but also you can find links there to the LF Energy projects. Of course, I advocate to take also a look at the LF Energy website where you can find a lot of information, great research papers, but also all the projects information. And in case, I did reach out in the early panel as well, but here as well, we as OSPO at Alliander also encourage open collaboration. So also we're happy to share our knowledge around OSPOs and this process as well. So don't hesitate to reach out to us as well.
Yeah, so we started with that, right? We get this question a lot. So how do you do this? Now, this is how we do this. But still, we're very much interested in having a chat. If you're starting a new OSPO, if you want to discuss with us how we deal with certain situations, we're more than happy to.
And if you have great suggestions for things we can do different, that's also, feedback is also welcome.
Yeah.
So let's go for the last 4 minutes into questions. Are there any questions here in the room? Yes.
Ah, nice.
I think I have a microphone here. So let's bring that to you, Thomas.
Yeah.
Hi. So Thomas Schuss, Sprint 1.
I'll stay here.
I was wondering, and maybe it's a bit off topic, but the energy industry is a relative collaborative industry. How would you convince more competitive industries like automobile industry to start open source projects or open source their internal projects where, yeah, they have a bunch of probably fears and so on, and their software, because usually there are new regulations they have to comply with, and they have new digital processes, and then everybody has it, not just one company. So what would you do? How would you start to convince them?
And I think I would not personally say that it's easier in our sector than the more competitive sectors, because I think there's a great examples in competitive sectors where you see that the open source way of working is really embraced. I always take the technology sector and the cloud native sector as example. And there you see that it's a very first competition in that sector, but that even they really embrace open source as a way to build that pre-competitive foundation each needs. You see also a similar trend now happening in the automotive industry. I know Mercedes is working, especially the German automotive industry. They also recognize if they want to accelerate the transition to a software-defined vehicle and to want to accelerate that movement or catch up the others, they cannot do it alone. They have to work together on that. So I think addressing that potential of open source, to work together on this pre-competitive foundation, which we all need to invest in, and that we all can benefit from investing into that together, I think is a really strong message which resonates well, I think, across sectors. So I think this is a message not only is applicable for vendors, but also for companies like us, but also for the public sector as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. See a question in the back.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Thank you. So Florie from Elia Group. I was just wondering, in your assessments somewhere in business case or before after, if you also have reflections on how can you get part of your investment back from the community through selling other services, etc., to not basically bear the cost of something you put open source and for everyone else being free in a regulatory environment. I guess that's a fair question to ask yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there's probably more organization has more experience in that than we. But there's also a lot of money into open source. There's also many ways to monetize open source. For us, that is not always the premium motivation to open source. So we see that for most of the projects we mentioned today, it's really to seek out that collaboration innovation. But we have also some internal discussions with one of our more startups, which are also more business focused, to see, hey, how can we use that open source approach to build an ecosystem around our projects, or even scale our ecosystem of products to a broader audience. And that's definitely something which is not into our process, but could be part of the process as well, to have that discussion. What are the options out there? Is an open core model interesting, or is it interesting to combine open source with consultancy services? And a lot of options out there, which I think makes also a lot of sense to potentially integrate in such a launch checklist as well. I'm happy to discuss that further if you're interested in.
Thank you.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I'll pass on the mic.
Thanks. Just stand up, I've got my laptop. Yes, Joshua Main from Pandora here with Mitch. I wanted to know, so you shared 7 steps, but you could also see them as areas. I guess, right, because they don't have to be in order. you probably don't have a lot of resources in a company to deal with a lot of this, but you do have a community out there. And I noticed that a lot of these steps potentially could be open sourced. Where do you see the potential of open sourcing the community helping you to go through these steps in an iterative way? I can imagine the legal assessment might be tricky, for example, but maybe other areas might not be. So where do you see the potential of open sourcing early with some of these steps and getting the community to help you already at an early point?
Yeah.
My main question would be, who is interested in doing this work? Because often it's not the most fun work to think of that, and some is internal strategy. So as Jonas said, it can help to make a project to release it when it's good enough, right? Say, okay, this is good enough, and we know we need to improve on these and these and these aspects, and we'll do that at a later stage. I could see that, but yeah.
And how do you know when it's good enough?
And that's a decision, right? It's like when you say code quality. Okay, it takes a lot of effort to improve that. So when you say, okay, this is there's no bugs that we know of. We have some tests, and we ensure that all the dependencies are up to date with regards to security. Okay, then we know we could add more tests. This and this can be improved in the code, but at least it's not bad software. I mean, all right, it's good enough. It's has no known vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I'd say something like that could be like, okay, this is reasonable, and we know we want to improve code quality over the time with the community.
And to add to that, so I think there's great ways to collaborate on this, and we leverage in this process also a lot of things out there of the community. So the basic of this process is built on top of the Linux Foundation process for open sourcing. And also those questions about the talk afterwards from Nico will dive into tooling, which helps us to review code if what's the quality, the security finding. And that there's a lot of open source tools out there in which we also reuse and contribute to take that benefit of the community to help us in this process. So I definitely see there also in this process, there's a great way to collaborate with one another and learn from one another's experience. But I see we're running out of time. We already are out of time, to be honest. So we have to wrap it up. So you will be around today and tomorrow, so don't hesitate to catch it during the coffee break for more questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.